Hi, everybody. This is Sam.
And this is Dillon, and welcome to the Church Chatter podcast.
So, before we get started, just know that if we sound calm, it's because it's nighttime. Usually, we record in the morning or during our kids' nap time, but we are recording in the evening and we're drinking sleepy time tea, so we're a little more calm tonight. So, this is episode 8, and the word that we are going to be unpacking is the word liturgy. So, we are going to talk about some of the culture and the purpose behind rituals, which rituals have everything to do with liturgy. And we're going to talk about the word liturgy. And because I study language and culture, that's what I'll be talking about. And then Dillon, who is the pastor, is going to explain liturgy specifically in the context of Christianity today and what it looks like in a lot of churches around the world. So I want to start with my doctoral dissertation research. I interviewed many women, and there was one woman who I interviewed who left the non-denominational church of her childhood, and she told me that she started attending a liturgical mainline church, specifically a Methodist church, and she said at first it felt really boring. But then she said, after I think it was a few months of attending this church, what she actually realized is it wasn't boring, it was safe. But to her, it felt boring compared to her first church. Actually, what she felt was safe and calm. And I'm going to circle back to that at the end, but I think that's a good place to start. I think that's really interesting. And I mean, I interviewed her, I think it was like a year and a half or 2 years ago now, and I'm still thinking about her saying that. So let's start with a couple things. And I'm going to talk a lot about liturgy, and if it doesn't make sense, I think Dillon will help really make it more practical and let you know what that looks like today in a lot of churches. But our modern life today has a lot to do with instant gratification, heightened emotions, being in a state of constant growth, right? But a liturgical life is kind of the antidote to all of these things. A liturgical life is a slow burn because life, for most of us, it's not a series of dramatic events. Every now and then, something sudden kind of occurs, like the loss of a loved one, graduations, marriages, divorces, illness, a diagnosis, right? But most of our life is actually spent doing common things. So I think of myself, right? Most of my life is doing the dishes, going for walks, driving to work, preparing meals, eating meals, cleaning the kitchen. I feel like so much of adulthood is cleaning the kitchen nonstop, folding laundry, sitting in meetings, right? These small rituals strung together over time create our lives. So liturgy gives meaning to what is repetitive and common. So liturgy is not about having, like, specifically in the context of church, it's not about going to church and crying and being slain in the spirit and all these heightened emotion things, right? And we're going to talk more about that. Liturgy gives shape to church life. But before we talk about church, I want to talk about just our everyday life. So liturgy is all about rituals. It has everything to do with rituals. So I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about the culture behind rituals. I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much I could say. So let's just talk about this. Throughout history, we see these completely different cultures with similar rain rituals, which is really interesting. These cultures who have never spoken to each other, they're completely separate. They have similar rain rituals. Here's the really fascinating part about these cultures is that they tend to exist in regions that are known for having long, unpredictable periods of drought or no rain. So these people don't know when their next rain is going to be. Again, separate cultures. They don't know when their next rain is going to be. So they have these rain rituals. And this is vital for their life together. There's an unpredictability in their life, this drought. And they didn't have running water. They didn't have electricity, all of this, right? So they need rain. So they have these rain rituals that give them a sense of unity and control where there is none. We still do this today. Where do we see rituals? Around death, around birth, right? Two unpredictable parts of life. We have rituals around mystery, rituals around unpredictability, rituals around suffering oftentimes, right? We think about death. Something that's really interesting about Dillon as a pastor, and I think a lot of pastors, is a lot of people are not interested in having a pastor. A lot of people don't want to talk to a pastor. A lot of people don't want to go to church. Great, that's fine. And then suddenly they're dying. And Dillon gets a lot of phone calls from people who have not gone to church in their adult life, and now suddenly they need a funeral, or a loved one died and they need to have a funeral. So there's something about death. People still want this religious ritual at the end. I think that's really interesting. Do you have anything to say about that?
No, just that it's true,
Yeah.
and regardless of whether a person is religious or spiritual or not, I never turn someone away to do a funeral. They don't just have to be a member of my parish, of my congregation. I will do it, but it is interesting. I do many funerals and many last rites rituals in hospitals and homes for people that pretty much throughout their life have never been overly spiritual or overly religious, and yet I will still offer them those things because that brings them comfort and peace.
Yeah. It makes me think of that Taylor Swift song, Soon You'll Get Better. There's a line that says, I might butcher it, but she says, desperate people find God, I think she said, or find faith, so now I pray to Jesus too. Which is essentially funny. Just saying that whenever we're desperate, people want religion oftentimes in suffering, and I think that's interesting. So, again, I'm just trying to make this connection between unpredictability and ritual. So in our home, we just did it actually, in our home we have rituals around a very unpredictable and chaotic time in family life, which is bedtime for our toddlers, our 2-year-old and 3-year-old. If you have kids or you've ever been around kids, you know that bedtime is a very unpredictable part of domestic life. So we give our kids rituals, a set of predictable actions to feel like there's some kind of control in the midst of the chaos. So we give them a bedtime. First, we all brush our teeth together. Then we put our jammies on. I call them jammies. Do you call them jammies?
I call them PJs.
PJs. Yeah, I call them jammies. Then they both pee on the potty one last time so they don't pee in the middle of the night, because then that's chaos. They pick out one book. We tuck them in. We sit in their bed with them and read them the book. Then we talk for a few minutes. Then we turn off the light and leave their room. So bedtime is a scary time for kids, right? They're separating from their parents for the night. Oftentimes there's tears if it's in our household. I think most households there's tears when they're young enough. So these rituals create a sense of safety and community and togetherness, and most importantly, predictability. So this sense of safeness, again, just like the woman I interviewed for my dissertation, or one of the women, who said that liturgy in a church made her feel safe because it's predictable, right? Just like the rain rituals for people who live in areas that are known for droughts throughout history. Rituals are the antidote to chaos and unpredictability. So it is true that too much rigidity, if you listen to our last episode, is a sign of unhealth, of course. But the opposite is also true. No sense of structure can be equally as unhealthy and chaotic. Everything about being a human is a paradox.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to mention one thing about the rain and the rain rituals. There's this interesting legend in the church, in the Christian church, mostly in the Western Christian church. So this would include the Roman Catholic Church and many of the Protestant churches. There's this idea that in May or June, when the church celebrates the festival of the Holy Trinity, there's something called Trinity Rain. And Trinity Rain, if it rains on Holy Trinity Sunday, on one of those major festivals of the church, there will be supposedly good planting for the spring, and that the crops will get a good rain. And so even in the Christian tradition, this is more a little bit of like a superstitious belief, but still there's this long-standing old ancient tradition that if it rains on Trinity Sunday, that the Holy Trinity will bless the fields and the plants in the spring so that they can grow and be harvested in the fall. So it's interesting as these rain rituals in all these different religions, Christianity also has this Trinity reign.
Yeah. I mean, religion 101, you can't talk about some roots of religion without talking about the weather. People were praying to gods because they wanted to get the gods on their side. Because if you didn't have rain, you wouldn't have crops and you would literally die. Your people could die off. It was very dangerous. So religion is very connected to the earth and the seasons and to rain. And we could talk about that for days too. But so this episode specifically is about liturgy. So, and liturgy, again, like I said, has everything to do with rituals surrounding unpredictable times in life. So if you find yourself being anti-ritual, I want to say this, Dillon and I, it's difficult sometimes because we want to talk about how Christianity has transformed us in a lot of ways. And we also want to be clear that it is not the only path for true transformation. It's not even the best path all the time. So it's hard to sometimes like walk that line. But I do want to say that if you find yourself being someone who's anti-ritual, just look around. Like, just look around. It's everywhere. You can't avoid it. I'm convinced that ritual is encoded in our DNA. We can't have a life without it. So the best parts of your life are likely made up of rituals. Some people have to go to yoga every week. Every Wednesday night, they've got to go to their 60 or 90-minute yoga, right? Or they need to exercise at the same time every day, or else their day just kind of falls apart. Or they have to have their oatmeal with blueberries in it every day at 6 a.m., or they just don't feel right the rest of the day. Or they cheer for their team every week and they put that jersey on, or they clean out their attic every spring, right? I mean, we could list hundreds of these. We build our lives around certain rituals because it helps us feel better. It helps us keep structure to things, right? They do these things. I mean, there's a reason this phrase exists. They do these things religiously. Even people who are anti-religion, fine, I get it. Religion has done a lot of bad things. Let's be all encompassing. Yes, of course. But we do things religiously. Their life is made better and fuller because of these rituals. So for me, I like to wake up around 4 a.m. I like to have a cup of coffee, and I like to write while I have that cup of coffee. I like to do it while everybody else in my family is still sleeping. I light a candle at my desk and I write while everybody else is asleep. This is a ritual. My days go better when I have an hour or two to do this. I don't do it every morning, but most mornings. And my days go better after this ritual, right? It gives shape to my day. I know a lot of people in recovery, they replace old rituals with new ones. Instead of waking up and getting high, they now wake up and go for a run or a walk, right? They need this ritual. It's not just individuals, right? Rituals are very communal. I remember hearing a story about this couple, this older couple in Maryland who were in their, I think their 80s. And for decades, they walked out their front door holding hands, and they walked the distance of their driveway to their mailbox to get their mail together every single day.
That's very sweet.
Yeah. This was a ritual within their marriage, right? Rituals make up relationships as well. Rituals provide safety. They keep the peace. They're kind of like the glue that give our life structure and keep the pieces of it together. Individuals, partnerships, marriages, families, we have rituals. So do communities. So let's talk about just the purpose of these rituals. So let's go back to these rain rituals that cultures throughout history have. These rituals had less to do with bringing on rain and more to do with people in the community coming together and pointing their attention in the same direction. So I think about Dillon and I during our bedtime rituals with our kids. If we did not have an expected set of actions to help us through bedtime, Dillon and I would likely turn on each other. Instead of the... It's funny because it has happened a couple times, right? I think parents, anybody who co-parents together knows that this is likely to happen. So instead, the predictability of the rituals, right, of the schedule, it creates a space for us to turn our attention to the same thing. We both know what's happening next. Otherwise, it's chaos. So one kid, our 2-year-old Sophia, she's only recently starting to pee on the potty, and she is known to run around naked and to pee on the floor. If it wasn't established that they have to choose one book, they would choose 50 books, and then we'd be fighting over what book we're reading, right? If they didn't pee before going to bed, we would likely have to wake up at midnight to a kid who peed the bed, which has happened when we forget to have them pee on the potty before they go to bed. So these rituals, my point is, they serve a purpose. It's not just random things that we're doing. They serve a purpose. Without them, Dylan and I would probably become so overwhelmed in the chaos and begin to argue with each other, and the structure would fall apart. Instead, the structure keeps the peace, or at least it contributes to keeping the peace. It's a vital part because Dylan and I are both pointing our attention in the same direction. We know the rituals. We know what's about to happen next. It's safe. It's peaceful. It's calmer than it would be otherwise. So does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Do you agree?
Absolutely.
So without communal rituals, communities who are experiencing a long drought and don't know when they will get rain again. And remember, they didn't have running water, so this was dangerous, right? They were thirsty, they needed water, they needed their crops to grow so they wouldn't starve in the next season. They would turn on each other, right? If people were afraid that they were going to die, if they knew they were in danger because of rain, they would turn on each other. Instead, a rain ritual helps the community experience this suffering and this fear and this unpredictability together, rather than to turn on each other. So it's somewhere where they can kind of turn their attention in the same direction. I like that phrase. So rituals are very human. Our current culture is obsessed with individuality, and there is a place for this. I don't want to diminish it. For sure, there's a place for it. But rituals create community. Rituals are how we turn our attention towards the same thing. I heard somebody say once that marriage is not about looking into each other's eyes, but looking outward in the same direction. I think that's true of any kind of relationship, even a church community. It's not about looking at each other all the time. It's about looking out in the same direction. And that's what rituals and liturgy can help us do. So, yeah.
Real quick, going back to that ancient practice of Trinity rain, of getting rain on Holy Trinity Sunday. So in May or June, it wasn't about like, oh God, like send the rain on this specific day and all will be well. There was probably a little bit of a part of that. But this legend, this practice of Trinity rain on Holy Trinity Sunday was also really focused on congregations or parishes that were in rural farming communities that would share meals together. And so they wanted to know that they would have communally enough rain so that their plants would grow, so that they would be able to have meals, so that they could come together at church after worship and they could eat together. And that was one of the things. It's this idea that like communally rain and water is good for us, and especially in the spring, and we need that for our plants to grow and to be able to share meals together at church. And so so you think once again, it's not just about this kind of like divine swooping in of God coming down and just giving rain on this special day, but it's this idea that, well, if rain comes in this specific time, it will help us all in the community so that we can continue to gather together to fellowship.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
And that's very much part of that practice, that custom, that legend and tradition of Trinity rain.
So let's get just a little existential. So this business of being human, it's actually Dylan. I mean, I shouldn't say Dylan and I talk about this a lot. I talk at Dylan a lot about this.
Do you?
Yeah. Being a human is really trippy. It's weird. It's chaotic. So we are all just walking around all day long, pretending like we aren't aware at a very visceral level that we could have cancer multiplying in our bodies right now. Or we could just drop dead tomorrow. We pretend that this kind of like ever-expanding universe that we're walking around within isn't the strangest kind of reality imaginable. So we create rituals, and I know that all sounds melodramatic, but it's also deeply true. It's deeply true. Being a human is the weirdest thing I could imagine, because we're just walking around and we really have no idea. Our life could turn upside down in an hour, in a minute. We have no idea what's going on here. Why are we here? What is happening? So we create rituals truly so we can all cope with the mystery of it all. So just like the rain rituals, people didn't know when rain was coming, this mystery, this unpredictability. I know I keep using that word, but I think that's really important. Culturally, the mystery is a lot to bear. And instead of turning on each other because we can't bear the mystery of it all, we create rituals, and rituals make up a liturgy so that we can bear it together. Like, what is going on here? So let's kind of transition now specifically into Christianity and rituals. So the earliest Jesus followers, they didn't care much about believing the right thing. They cared more about having the right rituals in place. So having the right beliefs, I don't like to throw around jargon too much, but having the right beliefs is called orthodoxy, and the right conduct and liturgy is called orthopraxy. So today in our culture and in today's Christianity, we tend to really care about orthodoxy. So are people believing the right thing? But this has actually not always been the case throughout Christian history. And I'm sure Dillon can say a lot more about that. I don't want to divert too much, but
that could be its own podcast.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, just the words orthodoxy and orthopraxy. But the whole point is there's pros and cons to both. But throughout Christian history, there have been times where people care more, and I really don't want to misrepresent Judaism, but I'd say that many expressions of Judaism, they care more about the rituals than are you believing the right thing. Like their rituals like Sabbath and their festival days are very important to them. Would you say that as well?
Yeah, I would say that.
Yeah.
And yet there are many Christian traditions or denominations that would also put much emphasis on orthopraxy, which is right practice. Mm-hmm. And then once again, there's other ones that they don't care about orthopraxy or right practice at all. They only care about orthodoxy, which is right belief, and they could care less what kind of practices you do or don't do. Yeah. So it's kind of basically, if you're looking for a church that is very, very orthodox, meaning they care a lot about what you specifically believe, you can find that. If you find a church or some type of religious organization that is looking at orthopraxy, right ritual or right practice, you can find that too. Yeah. And then there's ones that meet in the middle.
Yeah. So to kind of transition from rituals to liturgy, these practices, right, like orthopraxy, these practices are called rituals. And these rituals, when strung together, make up a liturgical life. So what is liturgy? Sacred liturgies are calm, they're repetitive, they're predictable. If you go to a liturgical church, and Dillon's really going to talk about what that means, it's likely not common that you will see people being slain in the spirit or talking in tongues or crying or having their hands in the air. You probably won't see a praise band that is of professional quality. A liturgical church service is not about having high emotions. It's about creating a space of communal predictability in the face of this great mystery called life or called God or whatever you want to call it, right? It's about small acts that make up a worship service in a church life. So let's quickly talk about, before Dillon grounds this for us, let's talk about the word liturgy. So the word liturgy comes from the Greek word that means public service and worship of the gods. So the word liturgy has an emphasis on the work of the public, meaning it has a lot to do with the community. A liturgy is how a community organizes itself. Every church has a liturgy. Some churches really reject labels. So again, I interviewed a lot of women for my doctoral dissertation who attended non-denominational churches in their childhood. And it was a really interesting experience to interview them, and I learned a lot. And a lot of them told me, just from the word non-denominational church, right? You can see a lot of them in their childhood, in their churches, their pastors and their families really rejected any notion of labels and liturgy and rituals. But the truth is, you can't really get away from it. Liturgy is built into humanity and community. You can't have a community without structure, and structure involves rituals, right? So some churches that you go to that claim to be non-liturgical, oftentimes, I mean, there's so many expressions of Christianity, so we're really simplifying here, but oftentimes you'll go in, there will be a praise band, maybe 20 minutes of singing, and then like a 45-minute sermon, right? That's still a liturgy. You can't get away from it. And I think that Dylan's going to talk more about that too, are you?
Yeah.
In a few minutes? Okay. So, but a liturgical church means, well, I'll let Dylan talk about that, but let me just say that I love going to a liturgical church because for me, most of my life is calm. And that doesn't mean that there's not anxiety and all of those things. I just mean I'm not every day experiencing illness. I'm not every day experiencing a graduation or a marriage or a divorce or a death or a diagnosis, right? All of these things. I'm not experiencing that all the time. Most of my life is driving to work or sitting next to my students and helping them write a 6-page paper, sentence by sentence, right? It's kind of like calm and even boring or safe, I would say. And I think a majority of people, unless we're living in a war-torn country where there's just like really traumatic things happening, a majority of people are not experiencing those things every day. So a liturgical church really helps us find God and connect to the divine really in these everyday calm things. So spirituality for me has to be found in the calm and common parts of life, or else I will rarely have access to it, right? I need a church service that is also a slow burn. So I don't want to linger on this too much because we will in the future have an episode on the word salvation. But when people tell me that they were saved on January 6th of 1999, for me, I don't know what that means, because for me, Christianity, religion, spirituality has been such a slow burn. I couldn't even tell you. There's no line in the sand for me of when it started and when. I don't know. It's been such a slow burn, and that's what liturgy is. It's a slow burn. So I don't want to leave a church service with an activated nervous system. I don't want to leave a church service having just cried for an hour with fear, right? I mean, I'll just say it again. I do not want to leave a church service with an activated nervous system. Honestly, I'm here for the peace. Faith for me has been a slow burn, so a church service for me has to be a slow burn. There has never been a moment that I can point to or a before and after. It's just this slow and steady and predictable and communal thing. And it's been something to point my focus towards within a community. And this is liturgy. So Dylan, after I just said all of that to kind of set it up, can you explain liturgy specifically within the context of Christianity and church today?
Yeah, sure. But before I begin that, I would just like to say that I myself personally have experienced many different types of liturgies, many different types of churches, churches from non-denominational churches to Pentecostal churches to free churches to very kind of traditionally evangelical churches to mainline churches to Catholic churches and Orthodox churches, and even Jewish synagogues who have their own liturgy, and Buddhist temples that have their own customs and forms. So
Dylan and I used to go to a Jewish synagogue in
I loved it.
Harrisburg on Friday nights before COVID happened, before we had babies and all those things. And yeah, it was beautiful.
It was beautiful. Some of the best liturgy,
music.
Some of the best singing and readings and prayers.
Yeah.
But so in my earlier years, I had a plethora of visiting and spending time in many different Christian and non-Christian communities, and so I am well aware of the fullness of religious liturgy and how some people worship. It might be different than others, and so this podcast is not to say that one is better than the other, but just to say that there are indeed differences both within Christianity and within other world religions. Liturgy, for me, as a Lutheran pastor, is high up there on my favorite things to think about and talk about. The Lutheran Church is a very highly liturgical church. It is one of the more liturgical Protestant churches, along with the Episcopal Church. And so anything to do with liturgy, I love. And I like to talk about liturgy in this way. I like to say that liturgy is sometimes like a well thought out waltz or a dance, or a staged play that is really, really well put together and ready for its first debut. And so just think about a well thought out waltz. Somebody doesn't just get on the dance floor and just kind of do what they do. They practice it and they put it together, and there's a form and there's a rhythm. And once it is played out and put together, you watch the waltz, you participate in the waltz, and it's beautiful. It's something that you can really embrace. The same thing with a well practiced play. When you see it on the stage, you are almost invited into it to participate with it, and it's not loosey-goosey, but it's well thought out.
And if that thought bothers you, if you're like, oh no, church shouldn't be like a play, it shouldn't be like theater. So I'm a professor, and I think about so Dillon and I, our jobs are very similar. He's a pastor, I'm a professor. We prepare and then we perform. Church is a performance that many people prepare for. Just like in the classroom, an educator, a professor, a teacher, they don't just show up, hopefully. The best ones are not going to just show up, and that doesn't mean it's not authentic. I know that rubs some people the wrong way of like, no, it's not like a play. But it is, though. It's a performance, right? There are people who have practiced lighting the candles and unlighting the candles, and the sermon is rehearsed and practiced and prepared, right? So, I think you want it to be that way. You don't want someone just showing up and winging it.
There's this argument in the church that liturgical worship, or what I just explained as a well thought out waltz or a well put together stage play or theatrical play, that the Holy Spirit is not present in that because it is planned and thought out. And that, to me, I could denounce immediately, because for me, the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, is in all stages of the planning and the worship, the whole thing. Even when you're planning worship, that is something that the Spirit is moving through. So there is this argument that liturgical worship is not Spirit-filled and more free-flowing worship is. I would just say that all forms of worship are filled with the Spirit. So I'll just leave that at that. So liturgy can be rather organized, or it can be free-flowing. But what liturgy does is it calls us to gather together in a certain type of order, right? So some churches have very formal liturgies with official worship books, like the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox and Lutherans and Episcopalians and others. And then some other churches are more informal, or they have more informal liturgies, and they do not have official worship books. These would be churches like Baptist churches, or independent congregational churches, non-denominational churches, or free churches. So you can have churches within Christianity that have very formal liturgy, or you could have churches within Christianity that have very informal liturgy, and some that have official liturgies within an official book, and other ones that just kind of, they evolve as they go.
And generally, whenever we say liturgical church, we mean Catholics, we mean Orthodox, we mean Lutheran,
Episcopalian, United Methodist, Presbyterian, Moravian, the United Church of Christ, the UCC to a certain extent. Those are liturgical churches. A liturgical church, in the most broadest definition, a liturgical church is a church that follows what's called the Revised Common Lectionary, meaning that they have assigned Bible readings each week, and they follow the church year, or the liturgical year, which has cycles and seasons of certain special days and seasons, which I'll talk about. Churches that are not liturgical do not have assigned Bible readings every week, and they do not follow the church year in terms of the cycles and seasons of special days.
And what are some churches that are non-liturgical typically?
So churches that are non-liturgical would be like the Southern Baptist Convention, the Assemblies of God, which is a Pentecostal tradition. You would see any non-denominational church that is not affiliated with a denomination tends to be a non-liturgical church. Any types of free churches, you can have a free church that is a part of a denomination or not a part of a denomination, but most free churches are not liturgical. You would see like the Bible Fellowship Church, they're not liturgical. Any type of Mennonite church or Quaker or something like that,
right.
they're not liturgical. I could go on, but that'll get a little boring. So liturgists, these are people that officially study liturgies of the church. Their title is liturgist. They put together 4 general components that make up a formal liturgy. This is speaking in the Christian tradition, and I'm gonna share them with you. The first one is that liturgy gathers people together in one place. So that could be a church, that could be a home, that could be a coffee shop, it could be at the park.
And remember, the word liturgy means...
It means in Greek, the work of the people, the coming together of the people. So that's the first thing. The first thing is gathering people together in one place. That's the first component of liturgy. The second component of liturgy is calls people to hear stories or lessons that both inspire and challenge. So these would be stories of the ancient Hebrew scriptures or the New Testament in Jewish traditions. In just the Jewish tradition, it would be stories on the Talmud or the Torah and the other writings. For the Hindu traditions, it would be lessons from the Vedas or lessons from the Quran in the Muslim tradition. But it's the coming together of people, again, gathering in one place to hear usually ancient stories. Sometimes groups will talk about modern stories, but most of them are ancient stories, and these ancient stories that we hear give us a type of moral or ethical lesson that both inspires us and both challenges us to do something. And then the third thing is liturgy invites us, this is rather specific to the Jewish and Christian tradition, but it is seen in other traditions. The liturgy invites people to eat together in the form of meals. That meal can take place right in the worship service itself or after it or before. In the Christian tradition, you will find this in the celebration of the Eucharist or communion, the bread and wine, both in the service, and you'll also find it in kind of potlucks or fellowship meals usually that follow after the service. So the liturgy invites us to eat together meals. And then the fourth one, the piece, is this sending. So we are sent out and we're blessed and we're given a charge, at least in the Christian tradition, to bring more heaven here on earth. And liturgical churches that we have been talking about in their set liturgy, in their set worship books, every week they will pray the Lord's Prayer together. And the Lord's Prayer says, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." And so it has been the strong tradition in the Christian churches that at the end, when you're sent out for the week, you're blessed and you're charged to bring more and more heaven to earth. So those are the 4 components of the liturgy. So the gathering, the hearing, the inviting to meals, and then the sending out.
And a big giveaway that you're in a liturgical church is if you walk in and they give you a bulletin to follow along with.
Yeah, you're in a liturgical
That's a liturgical church because what I love about liturgical churches is, so Jill and I obviously are Lutheran. We go to church every Sunday. The readings from the Bible that are read on Sunday are the same readings that are read at every liturgical church. I'll say across the country, but also
across the
globally.
world.
Okay, So globally, which is pretty cool, right? Like we're all reading the same texts. We're all praying the same prayers. We're all doing very similar and in some ways identical things.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that when I'm assigned readings as a Lutheran pastor on a Sunday, there's 4 different readings. There's one from the Hebrew scriptures. There is a psalm. There is a reading from usually one of Paul's epistles or one of his followers. And there's a gospel reading from one of the 4 gospels. And all those readings that are being read in the Lutheran Church are the same readings that are being read in the Roman Catholic Church right down the street from us. The UCC Church, that's right down the street from us. The Methodist and the Presbyterians. And many others. And so, although we believe some slightly different things, we're all reading the same Bible readings on the same day. And so that brings us not uniformity, but it brings unity to us as Christians, as followers of Jesus.
It's also the same text that people around the same time of the year have been reading for many centuries.
Yeah,
so
for
it
a very
connects
long
us
time.
to community here today, but also just like throughout history and with our ancestors, which I think is really important. It kind of brings, again, this unity across time and space, which is, I think, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Over the years in the Christian tradition, liturgies have evolved over time, but most liturgical churches, if you attend a liturgical church or you're thinking of attending a liturgical church, they have kept some very ancient Christian pieces to the liturgy. The first one is that when a baptism happens, the baptism will hopefully happen right within the service. It would be in one of 2 places. It would be in the beginning of the service, because it's the idea that in baptism, especially churches that baptize infants and children, you enter into the church through your birth. And so you're blessed there. So it would be at the beginning of the service.
Is it safe to say that liturgical churches tend to baptize babies, or does it?
Liturgical churches, for the most part, baptize infants and children. That's the custom. But they don't exclude the baptism of adults if they were not baptized as an infant or a child. Right. Yes.
Okay.
But they do not. Most liturgical churches do not practice believers' baptism, which is a more of an evangelical or Anabaptist practice. So some of the pieces it start out with, if there's a baptism, it's always done within the worship service. And then there's this other fun word, it's called the doxology, and it usually is in the beginning of the service, and it goes something like this. Glory be to the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. Amen. This is a very, very ancient and old greeting of the church, a doxology, usually at the beginning of the service. It could be at the end, but usually in the beginning. You have the Kyrie hymn, and it's been evolved. It's been tweaked a little bit over time, but it still has the same meaning and pretty much the same wording. And it's Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord bring us peace. It can be sung or it can be said. And that is an ancient part of the liturgy that's still kept in most churches. There's also something called the Gloria hymn, where it says, glory to God in the highest and peace to God's people on earth. And it continues on. That's an ancient part of it. The Psalms read responsively. Someone will read a line, and then the congregation or the people will repeat a line. That is very ancient to the church. That's one of the first readings of the church. Out of all the biblical readings is the responsive Psalms read back and forth.
Again, if you go to a liturgical church, this should sound familiar,
sure.
right? Dylan's just walking through the steps.
And then either the Nicene or the Apostles' Creed, that is very common. And then the prayers of the people come together for a specific time and we pray together. And then another fancy word is called the Sanctus, which is Latin, and it means holy, holy, holy. It can be sung or spoken, and it comes before you take communion. The other 2 things are, there is a specific, in liturgical churches, there's a specific either communion prayer or sometimes called Eucharistic prayer, and it is a prayer that the pastor prays and blesses the bread and wine before it is given and received. So that's a special prayer at communion. And then the Lord's Prayer, in which everyone prays together to remember Jesus' prayer to the Father, and a prayer that has pretty much become a common practice, both in personal devotion in people's daily lives, but specifically also in every week during worship. So those are kind of some ancient pieces of the liturgy that many, many liturgical churches have kept. And they have continued those to this day. Liturgy also is very interesting in that it handles some other things, and we have some fancy words here, and I'm going to explain them. But the first one that I'd like to talk about is something called vestments. And vestments are basically a type of clothing that the pastor could wear, or people that are assisting in worship, they might wear it, or the organist or the choir director or the people that are singing in the choir, they wear vestments. It's a special type of clothes. For the pastor, in some churches, there's things called pulpit robes, and pulpit robes are usually black, and underneath that the pastor might wear like a black shirt with a white collar, and then they wear this black robe over it. That is in more Reformed churches and churches that are close to John Calvin, if you might be familiar with some of those. But like in the Lutheran churches and many other liturgical churches, the common thing is to wear an alb. And an alb is a white robe, okay, and the pastor will wear a stole, which is a kind of piece of cloth that goes over their shoulders and hangs down, and then they wear a rope belt called a cincture. And sometimes when they're celebrating communion, they can wear something fun. It's called a chasuble, and it's kind of like this poncho-looking thing. There's also a cope. It's kind of like a cape thing, usually worn during evening services. And if you're lucky enough to be elected bishop in the Lutheran Church, or in some other churches, they appoint bishops. Bishops wear these funny hats. They're kind of a pointed hat in three. It's kind of like a triangle type looking thing. It's called a mitre, and the bishop also carries a crozier, which is a type of staff representing that the bishop has authority over a multitude of different congregations. So the bishop gets a special hat, and the bishop gets a special staff. So those are some of the clothing of the church that has to do with liturgy. And then there's something called paraments, and these are the decorative hangings that hang from the lectern, where the scriptures are read, from the altar, where communion is celebrated, and from the pulpit, where sermons are preached. And then there's also things like worship furniture. There's the baptismal font and the altar and the lectern and the pulpit. The special table called a credence table, where bread and wine and the offering are placed. There's something called a sanctuary lamp, and it's this lamp that burns all the time to remind us that Christ's presence is eternal in the church and the house of worship. And then there's something called an aumbry. Not every church has this, but it's a special place to put bread and wine that have been blessed and have not been taken by the people that are there, and it is reserved and saved for those who are dying and sick to be given to them and taken out by the pastor. And then there's something called vessels, and vessels are like baptismal shells. It's a special shell that you dip in the water, and then you pour it over the child or the adult's head to baptize them. There's something called a water ewer, which you pour the water into the font. And then there's cruets, these little crystal or glass pitchers for water and wine for communion, and oil for confirmation and baptism. And then there's the chalice and paten. Those are the things that you put the bread and wine in. Altar linens, these white things that go over, all these different types of things. Also, something that would be covered under these things is flowers. So people give flowers in honor of the living and in memory of the dead, and flowers are placed up and a part of worship, a part of the liturgy in the church. And there's all different types of candles, altar candles, candelabras, pew torches that are on near the pews, Advent wreath candles, the Paschal candle, which specifically has to do with Easter, and the the little handheld candles, which are most commonly used on Christmas Eve and at the Easter Vigil. And then the last thing is a procession. And a procession is something very beautiful to the church. It's when people process in and they process out of the worship service, and you can have somebody that's called a thurifer. And a thurifer is somebody who swings incense during worship. They go down and they go out and they help with incense in worship. Not as common in Protestant churches, but very common in Roman Catholic churches and Eastern Orthodox. So that's called a thurifer. And a crucifer, somebody who brings the cross down and takes the cross out. Acolytes and torchbearers who light the candles. A book bearer, somebody who carries either a Bible or the lessons that are assigned for the day. And a banner bearer, somebody that carries a banner special to the special season or the festival day, whatever it might be. Boy, that's a lot.
Yeah, and if some of that sounds really extra to you, I'll tell you that I used to be a really low church person.
It's not extra. It's wonderful. It's
Dillon loves liturgy. He loves all this stuff. And I used to say that my ideal church service was somewhere in a basement holding hands in a circle singing Kumbaya with people.
I like that too.
But the older I get and the more, not really about the older I get, but just the more I learn about the symbolism behind all of this stuff, I'll just give one example. And I know I say this every episode, but we will for sure have episodes about the symbolism of all of these things and like unpack it. But the more I learn about, I'll just give you one example. So when you go to a liturgical church, before anything even starts, you're sitting in the pews and somebody who's a member of the church wearing a robe walks into the sanctuary space with a candle already lit, and they go to the front and they light the candles, right? They have this long stick with the flame on the end and they light the candles. And then at the end of church, they also walk down and they put the candles out, and before they put out the last candle, they relight their flame on the end of this stick. Again, I'm just trying not to use jargon here.
Yeah.
This tall stick that they're carrying. And then they put out the last candle, and then they take that flame out of the sanctuary space. And I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but that's a symbol for we all came in here to worship, and now we need to take that worship out, right? Like it's the light of Christ now leaving the church, because we are all about to leave the church and the light leaves with us, right? It's deeply symbolic. And the more you know about these things, is it true that sometimes churches are spending too much money and being too grandiose, and then they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is feeding the poor, caring for the marginalized?
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah. Of course. And yet, I think it's important to acknowledge that we do not all have to take a vow of poverty, right? That's not the only way to live. Beauty matters, even at like a deeply natural kind of ecological. Right. So there's research that shows that bumblebees like to pollinate using the most beautiful flowers. They want the brightest flowers, the most symmetrical flowers, right? Beauty matters at a deep level, right? It changes the experience. It changes our posture towards things. There's a reason why throughout history, some of the cultures who have rain rituals, they're dressing up, they're playing music, right? It matters. It's not nothing. It's not extra. It's deeply human. So if you find yourself thinking like, oh, all these robes and these things and the incense and yada, yada, it's too much. Yes, it for sure can be, and it can be harmful depending on the overall picture. And yet it's not nothing. So we need to hold both of those things in tension.
As a pastor, I am a deep lover of liturgy and worship and worshiping well in a very festive way, and yet I'm also probably even much more a deeper lover of social justice and the teachings, the moral and ethical teachings of Jesus that call us to especially give aid and comfort and help and peace to those on the margins. And that means spending money to help people and offer programs at your church and your congregation by by uplifting those on the margins that have been oppressed and neglected. And so you can do both. You can balance them out. That's what I believe God calls us to do.
And again, liturgy is about keeping the story alive, right? Like I would say the greatest story ever told, which is the Jesus story, which has transformed so much. Even if you're not Christian, it has transformed the world in a lot of ways, for better or worse, truly. But the greatest story ever told, liturgy is about keeping that story alive, right? So I know that Dillon can be a stickler about some things. I know sometimes people have asked, like, oh, do we need to have live flowers? Can we just use fake flowers every week? And Dillon says no, because that's not keeping the story alive. That's not what the tradition is. That's not the point. Or like, oh, do we have to light the candles this week? Yes, we do. It's part of it, right? It keeps the story alive. It's symbolic. It matters.
Right. Absolutely. So just want to share a couple more things here with you in terms of like the rhythms of liturgy and specific to the rhythms of liturgy in a liturgical church. So if you were to go to a Roman Catholic church or any type of mainline Protestant church, once again, Lutheran, Methodist, Episcopal, Moravian, UCC, for the most part, you will see that that these churches follow the 6 liturgical seasons of the church year. And the 6 liturgical seasons of the church year, it begins with Advent. And Advent is observing the 4 weeks before Christmas, and it ends at dusk on Christmas Eve.
And we're in Advent now.
And we are going to be approaching Advent this Sunday on December 1st.
And this will be posted on December 1st.
And so we will be entering the season of Advent. So once again, Advent is the 4 weeks before Christmas, and it ends at dusk on Christmas Eve.
And our next episode is going to be about the word Advent, which actually goes back to the Roman Empire and has all kind of context there. So we're going to talk about the word Advent next week.
Yes. So we have the 4 weeks of Advent that take us up to Christmas, and then we come to Christmas. And Christmas is its own season. It's a season of 12 days, and it's observed from December 25th, which is Christmas Day, to Epiphany. And so Christmas is celebrated for 12 days from Christmas Day to Epiphany.
And I know a lot of Latino people call it Three Kings.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Three Kings Day, or also, what's the other one? I'm forgetting it.
I don't know.
They call it Theophany. Is another less common one, but that's a common name for Epiphany. And then there is something called a time after Epiphany.
Can I stop you really quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, the famous song, 12 Days of Christmas, right? On the 12th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me, right? 12 days of Christmas. It comes from liturgy, right?
Right, it comes from liturgy, and I'd like to, this might sound snarky, but a lot of people will listen to the 12 days of Christmas and thinking that they're the 12 days leading up to Christmas. That's not true. It is the 12 days after Christmas Day. So once again, it's from December 25th to Epiphany, which goes into January.
For Christians,
the first week of January.
For Christians especially, Christmas is not a day, it's a season. So keep those decorations up till January 6th at least. Don't take them down to your day. Yeah.
At least till January 6th, or at least till January 6th, or at least till the first Sunday in January. Okay, so after Advent, once again, comes Christmas, and after Christmas comes something called time after Epiphany, or ordinary time, where we learn about the stories of Jesus in a short period of time. And then after that time, we come to Lent, the season of Lent. And Lent is observed for 40 days before Easter. And it begins on Ash Wednesday. And depending on your certain tradition's calculation, sometimes some traditions will end Lent on the eve of Maundy Thursday during Holy Week, or some will say that it ends at dusk on Holy Saturday. But it is 40 days, and it does not include Sundays, technically. So after Lent, we get Holy Week, and Holy Week is Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and then that takes us into Easter. So then we get to Easter, and Easter is always observed on the first full moon after the spring equinox. And Easter lasts for 50 days. It's a season of 50 days, and it includes the celebration of Christ's ascension, and it ends on the day of Pentecost. And so after Pentecost, the Easter season is over. And then there's something called time after a Pentecost, which mostly takes you through the late spring, all through the summer, into the fall, and leads you up to Advent once again. And this, you get to, once again, learn the moral and ethical teachings of Jesus during his life, but also there are some special holy days and some special festival days that are kind of sprinkled in there throughout the time that we observe.
I know Dylan's about to talk about the colors, but also all of this, it's hard to explain in words. Liturgy is something really to experience.
Oh, you have to. It's
if
lovely.
you go to a liturgical church for a couple years, you'll start to see that, this is most clear Holy Week. So especially like you go to church on Good Friday, and typically the lights are down low, it's dark, you're there in the evening oftentimes. The colors are just dark. The music is always part of it too. The music is more like somber is the word. Somber. And then you come in on Easter Sunday and there's flowers and it's brighter and the colors are different and the music is upbeat, right? Like just the whole feeling, because again, if you know the story, Good Friday to Easter are very different emotions. Same for Advent. There's just this feeling of waiting and waiting. I know Dylan does this thing with our nativity scene where Jesus is not in our nativity scene until Christmas morning. And then do you have the three wise men? Is that who get closer and closer?
Yeah, they come closer and closer, but they don't come to the nativity until Epiphany.
And he'll move them. They'll be on top of the piano and they'll come closer and the kids have to go find them each week, which is kind of fun.
I do that practice not only at church, specifically for the children, but many adults actually love it. But I also do it at home here with Samantha and our girls who are 2 and 3, and it helps keep the story alive. And so with those 6 seasons come 6 different colors, and when you see the different colors changing with the seasons, it helps you move from one season to the next season. So the 6 colors are green, white, purple, red, blue, and black. And they change with different seasons. Green is ordinary time. White is for most of the special festivals of Christ and Mary and the saints and other church festivals. Purple's for Ash Wednesday and Lent, although in some traditions will use purple for Advent. Not Lutherans, but some. Red is for Palm Sunday, the days of Holy Week, the day of Pentecost, confirmations, ordinations, saints who are martyrs, meaning they've been killed for the faith, and on Reformation Day and Holy Cross Day. Those are red days. Blue is for Advent, specifically in Lutheran churches and Anglican Episcopal churches. And black is for Good Friday, and in some traditions, black is also used on Ash Wednesday. The church, at least in the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and most of the mainline Protestant churches, they have 11 major festivals that they celebrate throughout the year. And a festival is a very, very important holy day that people are encouraged to come to church 11 times out of the year on these special days, and most people do. And so these are the 11 major festival days of the church. It's Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. It's Epiphany Sunday or Epiphany Day.
Which is January 6th.
And obviously December 24th and December 25th for Christmas. The Baptism of Our Lord Sunday, which is always the second Sunday in January. And then Transfiguration Sunday, which is the last Sunday in the Epiphany season. Palm Sunday, which is the Sunday before Easter. Easter Sunday, which is obviously on Easter. Ascension Day, which can be observed on a Thursday or a Sunday. Pentecost Sunday, Holy Trinity Sunday, All Saints Day, which is either on November 1st or the first Sunday in November, and Christ the King Sunday, which is on the last Sunday of November. Those are the 11 major festivals of the church. There are also these really kind of interesting days. They're called special days of devotion and fasting. Fasting is encouraged on these days. And you can go to church. A lot of times churches will have different services, or you should just kind of center yourself to get a little closer maybe with God and kind of reflection on who you are on these special days. And the 5 special days of devotion and fasting are Ash Wednesday, which begins Lent, on all the Wednesdays in Lent, all the Fridays in Lent, on Maundy Thursday, which is the special day on Thursday in Holy Week, and Good Friday, which every Christian should hopefully know what Good Friday is. It's one of the special days within Holy Week that we remember Jesus' crucifixion. And so those are some of the special days and festivals and seasons of the church. But also there's other official liturgies of the church that the church has specific services for, and those are things like confession and forgiveness. Every week, at least in Lutheran churches and many other liturgical churches, people will come together and will pray the same prayer together, and the pastor will tell us and remind us that God forgives us. And it is the same prayer that we pray with the seasons and the special days. And it's not just something that we have to come up with on our own, but it's something that pulls us all together, community, to confess our sins and to know that we're forgiven. Holy Communion, it's a set service. There's no changes to it. There's a couple different services, but I don't get up there and just say, as a Lutheran pastor, and say whatever I want. It is a specific service. The same with baptism, and the same with anointing the sick and the dying. It's a specific thing. Anyone who is sick, anyone who is dying, I affirm specific words, words that are very ancient. I just don't say whatever I want. I can add some things from time to time, but everyone is getting the same treatment, right? The same with confirmation, the same with marriage, the same with ordination, and specifically funerals. Nowadays, funerals are becoming much more personalized, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but one of the ancient practices of the church is that everyone who has a funeral everyone who has a funeral is getting the same words that are being pronounced and blessed upon them. Specifically, the 23rd Psalm. That's something that's very common. A remembrance of baptism. Very, very common. The sprinkling of the water in remembrance of baptism at funerals. And then the last things that I have to share before we conclude with some of these things are, there are other types of rituals in the church, and really in all world religions, that people sometimes, they just kind of brush aside and say, well, I guess I don't really do that. But they're still there, and they're very much a part of the liturgy, the coming together and the gathering together. And some of these things look like blessings at the beginning of your day. So you wake up and you pray, or you give yourself a blessing for the day. God, help me have a good day today. I'm struggling with this. I'm looking to, I have a presentation at work. So praying as you wake up, and then praying also before you go to bed at night. Those are special rituals and prayers. Many people pray before they eat, sometimes just on holidays, sometimes every time, but giving blessings at meals. That's a type of ritual and liturgy. Blessing animals and pets, especially in the month of October, which is connected to St. Francis of Assisi, who is the patron saint of the environment and animals. A lot of churches do that. I do that in the Lutheran Church.
And we've heard some people say that it's a strange, oh, no, I don't want my pet to be blessed. I don't believe in that. But we'll bless houses, and we'll bless our food, and we'll bless someone when they sneeze, and we'll bless all these other things. But for some reason, some people draw the line at their pets, which is interesting.
And that's fine, but I'm just letting you know that it's fine to bless your pets, and I think it's a great thing. Mm-hmm. And not only is it it's not a superstition about oh, this is like some special thing that's going to make my pet like live forever. No, it can be a special blessing of peace and healing and comfort to your pet. It is very much that, but it's also this concept of bringing your pet and giving thanks to creation, giving thanks back to God for creation, that our pets and our animals and those whom we live in harmony with are a part of creation, and we give a blessing for that specifically to animals. We also bless wedding rings and Advent wreaths and candles and nativity scenes. And there's this fun one, the blessing of chalk. You bless chalk, and then you put this special sign above your doorpost on Epiphany to remind people that they are welcomed in, just like Jesus and Mary welcomed the Magi into their home. And so that the blessing of chalk has a specific ritual around Epiphany, and then also the blessing of the Paschal candle or the Easter candle on Easter Sunday, making the sign of the cross at baptism and confirmation and during remembrances of baptism, making the sign of the cross, being anointed with oil when you're sick or you're dying or in baptism. That's something. Once again, the blessing of a house. A lot of times people will call me and they'll say, hey, it's a new year, I'd like my house blessed. So I go out and I bless their house. Some people buy or they purchase or they build a new house and they'd like their house blessed. Something very common that I do as a Lutheran pastor is blessing people's houses. And then the last two is blessing of the harvest ingathering in the fall. So bringing specific, we talked about this in another episode, bringing a portion of the harvest and blessing it at the church. And also in the springtime, blessing the fields and the soils so that we'll have good planting. Kind of another link that goes back to that Trinity rain in May and June, where we give thanks to God, hoping that the rain will come in the spring, to give the community the plants that they need, the food that they need, so that they can have shared meals together. All of this
makes up a
liturgical life, a liturgical community, and some of it you might think, that really doesn't do it for me, and that's great, that's fine. And some of it you might be like, wow, I've never heard that before. I'd like to talk about that. I'd like to be interested in that. And many of these things you can find in liturgical churches.
And again, all these things work together. And if it sounds kind of boring just listening to it, again, it's because it's meant to be experienced. So if you go into a liturgical church, again, it's a slow burn. Give it time. Stay for a year or two and really experience the seasons. And you can start to feel... It's a way of living into the Jesus story. You start to feel on Holy Week or Lent that we're waiting. There's this dreadful thing that we know is coming and we're preparing for it. But then we also know that it's actually not dreadful in the end, right? There's something to celebrate. So same with Advent. We're waiting for this birth. Interestingly, our first daughter, Tabitha, who's almost 4, she was born December 28th, but her due date was December 19th. And so Advent for me in 2020, I felt like I was also awaiting the birth of my first child, and it really aligned with the church year of waiting the birth of Jesus. And it was really interesting for me and Dillon, I think, of we're waiting too, and she could come on Christmas. She didn't. She came 3 days later, but just that feeling, the music, the colors, the lighting, the everything in the church is prepared just like a staged thing, right?
Yeah.
To give you these feelings and to live into the story.
My favorite holiday, my favorite festival of the church is Easter. It is my absolute favorite. I love going in on Easter Sunday and preaching and celebrating communion. And there's flowers and candles and lights all over the place. I love it. But I could not imagine Palm Sunday without palms, without the blessing of palms and parading around and participating and remembering like Jesus going into Jerusalem. And I couldn't imagine Palm Sunday without the procession and without palms. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't be that for me. Well, I couldn't imagine Advent counting down and watching and waiting for Christ to come at Christmas without the Advent wreath and the candles and the prayers and the
again,
songs.
it's about community, and it's about entering into this tradition that's thousands of years old. The palms have to do with the Jesus story, yes, but it even predates the Jesus story, and we will for sure do an episode on palms because they are very connected to politics of the time. But we're entering into this thing that's thousands of years old that many people before us have done.
And so, some people will really maybe take issue with this, but this is the last thing that I'm going to say is I have asked people since I've been a pastor, what makes you love Christmas Eve? Why do you come on Christmas Eve? It's one of the biggest services in most churches. And they say, I come because there is something that brings me so much peace and so much joy when those lights are turned down and everyone is standing there with small little lit candles, and you just look around and it's twinkling lights and everyone is singing Silent Night, Holy Night.
That's
and it's
very moving.
And it's at that moment that you know that Jesus, who comes in the manger, is also being born anew in the light of darkness in the middle of the winter. And people might think, oh, that's just a bunch of hoopla. But it is a powerful, powerful experience. And people for centuries have been coming together and doing that on Christmas Eve. And I couldn't imagine Christmas Eve without candles and Silent Night,
Yeah. So there's not a right or wrong way to gather and worship, but I will say for myself that a non-liturgical worship style lacks ancient depth for me. I feel connected to those who came before me in a liturgical church. Here's something I do want to say, though. So if you go to a liturgical church, I know that it's not as easy or immediately accessible because in some other churches, you can simply walk in, sing some songs with the praise band, listen to a 40-minute sermon, and leave. And you probably leave with an active nervous system in some way. Maybe you cried, maybe you feel guilty or shame.
But some people might also be inspired and challenged.
I was for sure going to get there. Or you feel challenged in a good way or convicted in a necessary way, right? All of these things. And I think that there is a time and a space for that. I think that for me, again, there's not a right or wrong way. For me, experiencing that every Sunday, like a heightened emotion, I would struggle with. But again, it is more accessible, and that's the beauty of non-liturgical churches is you can walk in, there's no bulletin, you can follow along, there's no hymn book, right? You understand what's going on. But I will say in a liturgical church, there's a bulletin to follow along with, a hymn book. There's a different color up front all the time. There's symbols everywhere that probably don't make sense to you if you don't explore it more, if you're not educated a little more about it. But the depth of it all, it's like this never-ending exploration, and it brings me further into the story. It also, and this is where I want to end because I think it's really important, it decenters the pastor. So, again, non-denominational churches, if that's what does it for you, if you're really moved by the music that they play or whatever, go for it. Great. This episode, though, is about liturgy, and we are Lutherans, so we're coming at it from our perspective, which is... again, for my doctoral dissertation, I interviewed a bunch of women, and most of them went to non-denominational churches as children. All but one of these women told me that their non-denominational churches of their childhood had either split into multiple churches or straight up closed because of some sort of drama with the pastor. Liturgical churches are not built around the pastor. They're not built around one or two people in leadership. They're built around the story. They're built around liturgy. They're built around the community because liturgy is of the people, right? It's about the people. So it's centered on the community rather than leadership. And here's what's really kind of paradoxical about that is a lot of non-denominational churches kind of resent the hierarchy of church, right? Like the pastor and the bishop and this and that. And I totally get that. I totally get the bureaucracy of it at some level, how that can become problematic sometimes. However, inevitably what happened, though, is a lot of these churches, and my dissertation research this is a huge finding of my research, was, I'm not really finding because we already knew it, but I had data to confirm that non-denominational churches oftentimes won't last more than 1 or 2 generations, because if something happens with the pastor who started the church, then it just kind of crumbles because it's built around that pastor and their 40-minute sermons and the readings that they choose. And that can be really beautiful for a generation or 2, but it doesn't last. So that is a con of not having liturgy. Again, it's accessible, it's easy. I think that there are definitely some pros to a non-denominational or a non-liturgical church, I really should say. But the thing that liturgy has going for it is it's a slow burn, and a slow burn can burn for a very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing about as a Lutheran pastor in a liturgical church, I come together every Sunday and I give personal stories in my sermon and do those types of things. But I follow the official liturgies of the church, the official hymnody of the church. I don't get to change the church's teachings and doctrines just because that's what I want to do. I have been called, and I've vowed through my ordination vows, to uphold the teachings and the liturgy and the hymnody of the Lutheran Church. And so I might be at my parish for 20 years or more. And once I leave, or I could be there 5, you never know. You never know. But when I leave, the liturgy is still going to be there. The hymnody is still going to be there. The teachings of the Lutheran Church are still going to be there. Where some other churches that are of persuasions of non-denominationalism or more free churches, every time a new pastor comes in, it can indeed change. And that leaves a community kind of roller coastery. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm not even saying that it's bad. I'm just saying there is a beauty to more liturgical churches that have stability.
It's true of all institutions too. It's called founder syndrome. If any institution is built too much around the founder of that institution or the leader of the institution, it will inevitably crumble. It's true of politics as well, right? If it's built around one person, one leader, or just one small group of leaders, a lot of times with non-denominational churches, it's a group of lay people who wanted to start their own church, so they found a pastor, and then they are in charge for 20 or 30 years, and then inevitably there's some drama, there's some fight, somebody dies, the pastor dies, and it's founder syndrome. The thing crumbles around it because there's nothing else holding it together. Again, if you remember in the beginning, I said liturgy is like the glue that holds something together. So before Dillon came to the church that we are at now as the pastor, they didn't have a pastor because their pastor had unfortunately passed away. So as is the case with most liturgical churches, they were fine. That's not to say that there wasn't they didn't slow down a little bit without a pastor, but they survived because it's built around liturgy and the community and the story more than the pastor. So they were fine. They were able to hold the community together until a new leader came in. And eventually Dillon could leave tomorrow, or he could leave in 20 years, and they will be fine. They'll continue.
So there you have it.
There you have it.
Liturgy. It was a little bit of a longer one this time, but there's a lot here, and we hope that you enjoyed it. We hope that it will get you excited. Especially remember, Advent is beginning this Sunday. If you know all about Advent, then continue to get excited about it. If you've never heard of Advent before, go to some liturgical church and experience it for the next 4 weeks, and get you ready for Christmas.
Don't be discouraged if you go to a liturgical church and you have no idea what's going on. For me, that's the fun of it. Is you could spend your entire life studying liturgy and you still won't have all of it, because the symbolism of it all, there's such depth to it. It's thousands and thousands of years old. In some ways, it even extends beyond Christianity and taps into sometimes the Roman Empire, also sometimes Judaism. There's some holdovers from Judaism, right? It's very old. There's no end to this rabbit hole that you can fall down. So don't be afraid just because you don't understand it right away. All right, that's liturgy. Enjoy. And this is the setup for Advent, because Advent is part of the liturgical calendar, and that's what we're going to talk about next week. So like always, go find us on Instagram. It's at church_chatter_podcast. Also, we are on YouTube. I don't know if I said that last episode. So we're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, but also YouTube if that's easier for you. We're on all those places. Bye.
Bye.